We're going to begin this module by discussing some paint preparation and materials preparation, as well as look at some very fundamentals of using scenic paint. If you remember from the previous lessons, we discussed that the type of paint we're going to be using is a vinyl acrylic. Vinyl acrylic, so it's an acrylic paint. It is water-based, meaning that the foundation, the very first medium that we use, the very first liquid you use is water. And then we're adding a vinyl plastic to that includes various pigments, binders, which is the vinyl part of the acrylic part, and then other filler materials to make it thicker. All right, so paint, no matter what it is, whether it's a latex paint or an oil paint, has typically those components. It's base material, whether it's water or oil. It's filler material. It's pigment, and also it's glue or it's binder. All right, so vinyl acrylic is essentially its binder and its filler in this type of paint. So you can mix watercolor, you can mix water inks, as long as it's a water-based ink. You can mix acrylic paint. The key through line with all of these is that they are all water-based. What you cannot do, you cannot mix a oil base with a water base. You will get a mess. You probably all heard oil and water do not mix. Well, that works with paint as well. So we're going to focus on water-based paints. That is the most, it's non-toxic. It doesn't contain noxious fumes. It's typically safe to work with in an enclosed environment. With a lot of oil-based paints have other very harmful chemicals. They require solvents and other toxic type of chemicals in order for cleanup or for different mediums in order to work with them. That's why a lot of oil paint and oil painting can be a kind of a hazardous type of endeavor. So we try to be as healthy as we can. So what I've chosen here is I have 2 of our 1-inch chip brushes. I recommend taking some time to just kind of grab them and tug on the ends. You'll find hairs that fall out. We want to get all those out if we can that are loose. There's a reason these are only like 50 cents at the hardware store. They're very cheap, but they're disposable. They're they'll disintegrate in the landfill. I mean, it's just wood, a little bit of thin metal, and some bristle. This is hog bristle. So these are good for disposable. We like those. So I'm going to take a moment to kind of pull that out. You can see that they're not consistent. So sometimes I'll even take a pair of scissors and kind of flatten this out and give it a little haircut. All right, just to kind of get those extra hairs off. Right. Same thing with this one. So this is just getting some preparation. Don't be afraid to kind of work on your paintbrushes. It's okay to kind of later when we do a graining brush, we'll even chop into it to give it some more characteristics. I grabbed a filbert brush here as well. This is your typical little artist brush. We're doing this scaled down in a more controlled by using Bristol board. If this was scenic art, we would be using flats and large pieces of scenery. And instead of using little brushes like this, we might be using large brushes like this. This is a large lay-in brush that we would paint a large area with very quickly. Doing the same sort of technique, but instead of using this little 1-inch brush, we're using a larger brush for the same idea. So just get an idea that we are painting in scale. All right. I have a piece of Bristol board here prepared. Just a piece of Bristol board to work with. I like to use these little Glad containers. You can easily put a lid on them and cover them up and come back, and your paint doesn't dry out between. At least I can get weeks and weeks worth of use out of the same dabs of paint, where if I just leave it on a palette and walk away in a couple hours, it'll be completely dry. The rest of the paint will be wasted. So try to, I would recommend get you a little food container that seals, and I like these little things. Plus I can lay it on top of like I have white paper underneath this, and I can kind of even lay my color on top of what I'm working on to see how this affects whatever I'm painting below. It's a good gauge on working color with color. All right. I'm going to go ahead and talk about some fundamentals here. One of the first one is when you first bring paint out of the can, it is fully saturated. All right. It is thick paint. You see how there's a little bit of water in here, but this paint is very thick. All right. So whenever you use a brush, go ahead and wet it first. So I have a little water container here. So I'm just going to wet that and then wipe off that preps the bristles a little bit, gets them ready to accept paint. So when you use any of this paint, it's very, you can see it's very thick, right? So I'm just kind of moving the paint around a little bit. And if I apply this to my surface, I'm just going to play around this. You just see how paint works. If I paint with, you can see it breaks apart as I pull, all right? As I pull this, it kind of falls apart. It doesn't keep a solid line, right? So that's straight paint. There's no added water, any other medium added to that. We typically don't use paint like this. This is just the way it comes. And we know that this paint goes very, very far. So we will add medium to it. Now, what is medium? Medium is water. Medium is also the glaze that I gave you all. So glaze is the material. I poured a little bit in this bucket here. It looks white. It looks like white paint. The thing is it's not. When it dries clear. So glaze is essentially the binder without any pigment in it. So we can add binder to that to make our paint a little bit thicker or a little more mobile. It'll move a little bit. So if I put a little bit of our medium in my little palette here, put a little bit there. So I don't need very much. All right. Remember, we got the rest of the semester. We need our medium that we gave you. So I can add a little bit of medium to this, to my blue. And what that's doing, I'm not adding water, I'm adding medium. Now it looks a little bit thinner, it's okay, but look how it applies now. It's very different than this. Now I've got a solid area that I was able to paint with that blue, right? Where this was very broken apart. This looks a little thinner. It is thinner because I've added medium to it. So if it's too thin, I can go back and add more pigment and add to that same mix, right? So I can make that, I can adjust how opaque my paint is. So this is much more opaque, right? If I add more medium, if I go a lot more medium, that means that there's more medium ratio to the pigment, right? So in my little mix here, it's still blue, but now it's very thin. Why would I want that? The reason I want to do that is if I'm mixing colors and I want to lay them on top of each other and have the colors kind of blend more like a stain or more like a dye, I can make it very thin using the medium, a thin mix, and put that on top of each other. So let's let that dry a little bit. I'm going to rinse my brush out in my water container. And I'm going to do the same thing with the orange. So I'm going to take a little bit of the medium and add some orange to it, but I'm going to go very heavy on the medium. You see, there's a ton of pigment in this paint. You got to understand that this is not the household paint you get at Home Depot or Lowe's. This is artist grade paint. Very, very thick with pigment. The only issue I have right now is the paints I gave you. I've been on the shelf for a year and are starting to separate a little bit. So what I can do now, you can see I've mixed a lot of my medium into my orange, and I can kind of move this on, and I can layer on top of colors. You can see that blue is still coming through, but you can see I'm getting more of a neutral color because light is going through the orange and going through the blue and then bouncing back to your eye, which makes this area look a little more brown, a little darker, okay? So this is the use of medium. You can use it like very thin to do washes and to do layering of paints to get more interesting kind of effects. You can see this is starting to dry now. None of that looks white. This looks kind of almost like a watercolor effect, which is typically the way that we work with scenic arts. This isn't oil painting. This is scenic painting. So I think the one definition you need to understand is that it's not house painting, where we want everything to be very opaque, and that's the way house paints, latex paints, and oil paints for home are designed for painting areas and for coverage and for a solid color. This isn't oil painting where you're mixing oils and turpentines and other kinds of materials. This isn't watercolor where your medium is water. This is scenic painting. It's completely different. It's most closely related to acrylic painting. So considering it is a vinyl acrylic medium, all right? So this is the first thing I want you to understand is the difference between straight paint right out of the can and kind of a application. You'll find that it does not move very easily. It breaks apart. By adding medium, you can adjust how thick your paint is and how thin. So in this case, it's a little thicker and it goes thinner. Here's a very thin with a lot of medium in it. And here are layering of medium, two different colors on top of each other. How we're almost mixing our color in real time. You get that kind of brownish color because we know that blue and orange are complementary colors. And so in the middle, by blending, we can get some interesting neutral browns. And instead of mixing it in our palette to get that, we can play around with layering. This is sort of a technique. If we look at the Mona Lisa and all that, all of those beautiful textures that make the Mona Lisa look very human, very, very luminous, is because Da Vinci did this type of painting. He did layers upon layers of very, very glazy paint in order to bring let the light go through each layer and bounce back to your eye to create very rich colors. Okay, so that's our first step. You may be asking, well, why can't I use just water, right? All right, so let's see what happens if we use just water. Right? I just have some water on my brush, and I'm going to mix in water onto my brush. I'm mixing water, no medium, all right? The problem with this is that as I add water and I brush it on, it's kind of similar, right? It is a very watery paint. It is blue, it's covering our area. Our problem is a problem that happens after the fact. So as we paint, especially when we're painting on canvases or other surfaces, by diluting it with water, we're diluting the binder, the glue of the paint. We're making the glue less effective. So what happens on a lot of flats and scenery, if we just have this very watercolory paint, yeah, it looks fine. We have pigment. That's what we want, but you get a separation later. The paint doesn't stick. It'll actually, especially on flat, very smooth surfaces like wood or panel or masonite, as you walk on it, if it was a floor, as the lights are hitting it, the paint will actually start to flake off because there's no glue holding the paint to the surface. So we have to, if you want to use water, you can use water for manipulating how watercolory, like this looks acrylic, this looks a lot more like watercolor, but I definitely want to make sure that I'm adding a ample amount of medium to this to replace the missing binder, the missing glue that the water is displacing, so that I can still get a nice watercolor look, but I've replaced the glue so I don't lose the potency of the glue. All right. So that's the first things I wanted to talk to a little bit about: use of paint, use of the the binder. In this case, we have a glaze. This is a flat glaze. You can get glaze that are glossy, semi-gloss, satin. Glaze comes in all kinds of different finishes, how shiny and how dull the paint is. But in this case, I've given you a flat glaze material so that it doesn't affect the look of the paint, all right? The next thing I want to talk about is some basic paint theory, color theory. When you use a color, any color, so in this case, I'm going to use blue. I'm going to add a little bit of medium to it. The correct term for color is hue, H-U-E. This particular hue's name is phthalo blue. I really like this blue. It's one of my favorite blues. It reminds me of what you would think of as crayon or primary blue. But in this case, this would be phthalo blue. That's the hue we're working with, right? Let me write that down. All right, so this is our hue. P-T-H-A-L, phthalo blue. All right, now, as we go up in value and down in value, we are changing it in terms of a shade. So you probably heard a shade of blue, all right? Or a tint of blue. Now, what are these two? What are the difference, all right? In color theory, the difference between a tint and a shade is the difference between adding white or adding black, okay? This would be tint and shade, all right? So I've got a little bit of white here. Let me add a little white to my palette. All right, so I've got a little bit of white. Let me put that on my palette here. This is white, and this is glaze. You can see they're a little different. This one has pigment in it. This has no pigment in it, all right? So there's my white. And I've got some black here. Should have tested this. My black is all black. All right, so I'm going to add a little bit of black over here in the corner. Okay. So illustrate the difference between a tint and a shade. So if I use my same brush, I'm going to add a little bit of white here. I've got a little bit of my medium and a little bit of blue. So I'm going to mix that in. And as you add white and add a little bit more white, maybe a little more medium to kind of thin it out, you can get lighter and lighter tints. Okay. Okay, so you can kind of see this goes, the light's kind of reflecting on it, but this kind of goes from the pure hue, the pure phthalo blue, and then gradually makes its way up towards pure white, right? So my brush is a little dirty, but the idea is that it's a gradation of different tints, and you'll see that, you know, if you look at any, you'll have various tints of a particular hue, all right? Now the same thing goes for the shade. Let me clean my brush out of my water here. I don't want any more of that white on there. And the same thing goes if I have blue a little bit of medium to kind of make things flow better. And add a touch of the black. Not very much. You'll get darker. It went really dark real quick. And you get a darker and darker shades as you go down. Now, boy, it went dark real quick. This is the problem that I was trying to express when we were delivering paints, is that the white I gave you is household latex paint. It's water-based, so I know it'll mix. But the problem is household latex paint has a lot of binder. I mean, a lot, and very little pigment. So it takes a lot of this to make any shift in the tint, all right, from to white, where the black is vinyl acrylic paint. It is made to work with this, which means that it has a lot of pigment, the actual color in it. So it takes very little of this to make a shift, whereas it takes a lot of the white. So you can see how this, boom, went black almost immediately. But see, if I go back and let's kind of play around a little bit. This is why it's always good to have a second piece of paper or a second piece of canvas when you're painting, so you can test out your colors before you put it directly on your artwork. So see, let's see, that's a little bit better, right? So you can kind of see this was the original hue, and as I add, this is almost like a navy-ish blue now. It's probably not showing up too well because of the way the lighting is here. It almost looks black. To me, this is very navy looking, right? And then as you add more and more black to it, you can get down to a pure black at the end. So this is basically illustrate the difference between a tint and a shade. I encourage you to play around with this to kind of see how that works. All right. So that's dealing with tint shade. The next thing I wanted you to see is whenever you're mixing neutral colors, sometimes the best color combinations are ones that are complementary. All right. So we already looked at our color wheel last time, and we knew that blue and our orange, bring that down, blue and our orange are complementary. All right, so we've got our two colors here, and by playing around a little bit with our, we can play with our tint, our shade, and our complements. We can get some very interesting grays, browns, things that are much more neutral. So in this case, I'm playing with a little bit. I want a kind of an orangey brown color. So I'm mixing. Complementary is the easiest way to find those kind of colors. So if I want something that feels a little warm, feels a little bit orange in its look, so it's more of an orange brown, but let's say I want it to be lighter. I don't want it to be dark. I want it to be lighter. I can always add a little bit of white to raise the tint, right? So now I have almost a flesh color. That flesh color, this is sort of a darker flesh color. I can add more white to it. Maybe a little bit more medium to kind of blend it a little bit. Maybe a little more white. And so I can play around with the tints of this kind of fleshy color, right? So this is a kind of a darker flesh. Here's a little lighter flesh. Maybe I go even lighter. See? So this is how you can mix colors. And you know, you can start off with, all right, I wanted more of a orangey brown or a warm brown. And by, this light is terrible, but as you can see, this is sort of a darker, almost a brown color. And as I added more white to it, I get a lighter. If I wanted to do the opposite, and let's say I wanted the orangey brown color to have more of a shade, I might add a touch of the black to it. Now see, this is getting watery, so I could better add a little bit of medium there. All right, so I can add a little bit of that. You got to be very careful with black. Black is one of those colors that is very strong and can create havoc on your color. So now I've got a nice, oh, this is a nice brown, almost that burnt umber color that I like so much. So now I'm getting more. Mind you, I've only started with 2 colors, really, and then our white and black, so really 4 colors. But you know, I can really get some very rich browns, very natural colors just by mixing my 2 complements and then playing with the tint and shade to get other range of colors. All right, so this is a good way to play with your colors. I highly recommend mixing colors before you apply. That way you're comfortable, and you can always use your palette here sometimes to lay it on top, and you can compare colors in your little tray here with what's underneath on the actual. So like I painted there, what happens if I lay this on top? I kind of get a sense of colors underneath sometimes. So anyway, all right, so that's preparation. Make sure you've got some brushes for the next part, and you've got a fresh piece of paper. I'm going to put all this away, and we'll start the next part. Hopefully you got something out of this.